A routine traffic stop spirals out of control when a pregnant woman is handcuffed on the side of the road. But just 10 minutes later, the police chief storms in, and everything changes. What happened in those 10 minutes to flip the script? And why was this officer's secret history hidden for so long? You won't believe how deep this story goes. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications so you never miss a new one. The morning sun shone brightly over the quiet neighborhood, where the streets were still coming alive with the sounds of everyday life. Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car near the corner of Maple and 3rd, sipping coffee and scanning the traffic. He was fresh out of the academy, eager to make his mark. This wasn't a neighborhood where much usually happened, but Daniels took pride in being sharp and alert. He believed in the rules, and today, he told himself, was just another day to uphold them. Just as he finished his coffee, a car rolled through a stop sign at the intersection ahead. It was a small, older sedan with a dented bumper and faded paint. Daniels frowned, flipped on his lights, and followed the car. As it pulled over, he noted the driver, a young black woman, visibly pregnant, stepping out slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel for support before she fully stood. She seemed nervous but composed as Daniels approached her window. "License and registration," Daniels said curtly, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The woman, whose name he would soon learn was Maya Johnson, nodded and reached for her purse on the passenger seat. She moved carefully, her movements deliberate, but Daniels's hand instinctively hovered near his holster. "Slowly," he warned, his voice sharper now. Maya paused, then continued to retrieve her wallet. "Officer," Maya said, her voice calm but strained. "I'm just trying to get to my doctor's appointment. I know I should have stopped completely, but Daniels cut her off. "The law doesn't make exceptions," he snapped. "A rolling stop is a violation, pregnant or not." Maya blinked at him, her expression faltering. "I understand, but I really need to—" "Step out of the car," Daniels interrupted. His words were more a command than a request. She hesitated, confusion and concern flashing across her face. "Is this really necessary? I wasn't speeding. I didn't mean to." "Step out of the car!" Daniels raised his voice. Maya sighed heavily and opened the door, carefully swinging her legs out and holding onto the roof for balance. She was visibly pregnant, her hand resting on her belly, her movements slow. People passing by began to take notice, some glancing curiously at the scene unfolding. "I'm not resisting," Maya said softly, her voice steady despite the anxiety clearly etched on her face. "I just need to get to my appointment." Daniels didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for her to step aside, pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists before she could protest further. Maya gasped, her discomfort evident as the metal pressed against her skin. "You're under arrest," Daniels said coldly. "Failure to comply and obstruction." "But I didn't—" Maya's voice cracked, but she stopped herself, clenching her jaw as her breathing quickened. "Please, this is dangerous for my baby." Daniels ignored her, guiding her toward the patrol car as she shuffled awkwardly, her face twisting in pain. The small crowd that had started to gather murmured amongst themselves, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some held up their phones, recording the encounter. A few called out in protest, but Daniels paid no attention. His mind was focused on protocol, his belief that he was doing his duty. He didn't see the injustice brewing, but someone else was watching. Before Daniels could get Maya into the back of his patrol car, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Chief Angela Bryant. She moved with purpose, her sharp eyes narrowing at the scene before her. Daniels froze as the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their cameras now turning toward the chief. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere, but it wasn't clear yet what she would do next. Chief Angela Bryant's voice cut through the tense air like a blade. "Daniels, what's going on here?" she demanded, her tone calm but carrying undeniable authority. Her sharp gaze shifted between the young woman whose hands were cuffed behind her back and the officer, who suddenly looked less sure of himself. Daniels straightened up, his jaw tightening. "Routine traffic stop, Chief," he said quickly, trying to sound confident. "She ran a stop sign and became uncooperative. I had to detain her for safety reasons." The chief's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, towering over Daniels despite her slightly smaller frame. Her presence seemed to shrink him. "Uncooperative?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "She's pregnant. Look at her." Maya, struggling to stand upright with the cuffs digging into her wrists, turned her head to the chief. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't resisting. I was just trying to explain about my appointment." Chief Bryant raised a hand gently toward Maya, signaling for her to hold on. Then she fixed Daniels with a piercing glare. "Take the cuffs off, now." Daniels hesitated. "Chief, Did I stutter, Officer Daniels?" Chief Bryant's tone dropped lower, and her words carried a weight that silenced any further argument. "Remove the cuffs." Reluctantly, Daniels reached for the keys and unlocked the cuffs, his hands stiff and reluctant. Maya exhaled deeply as her hands were freed, rubbing her sore wrists. She looked at the chief with a mix of relief and gratitude, but her legs wobbled, and she reached out for balance. The chief stepped forward instinctively, placing a steady hand on Maya's arm. "Are you all right?" Brian asked, her voice softening as she guided Maya to sit on the curb. "Do you need medical attention?" Maya shook her head but winced. "I'm just in pain from standing too long," she said, her breathing uneven. "I need to get to the clinic." Chief Bryant nodded, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "We'll get you there," she said firmly before standing and turning her attention back to Daniels. Her expression hardened. "What were you thinking, Daniels? A pregnant woman handcuffed in distress? You call that good judgment?" Daniels opened his mouth, but the chief didn't give him a chance to respond. "You're coming back to the station with me. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a review of your actions today." The crowd, now larger and more vocal, started clapping and murmuring their approval. Someone shouted, "Finally, some accountability." Daniel's face flushed red as he muttered, "Yes, Chief," his eyes glued to the ground. "Good," Chief Bryant said, then turned to Maya again. "Let me make this right. I'll personally make sure you get to your appointment." Maya nodded, her voice barely audible as she said, "Thank you." The chief helped her to her car, all while the crowd continued recording, their phones capturing every moment. The whispers among them grew louder, speculating about what might happen to Daniels. Some called for more action, while others shook their heads, wondering how it had gotten this far. The tension lingered in the air, but something had shifted. Chief Bryant had taken charge, and her actions spoke louder than words. Still, as Daniels walked toward the chief's SUV under her watchful eye, a faint shadow crossed her face. She knew this wasn't the end of it. As the chief drove Maya to the clinic, the silence in the car was heavy. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting on her belly, her breathing still uneven. Chief Bryant glanced over at her, her stern demeanor softening slightly. "You sure you're okay?" the chief asked again, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. Maya nodded, though her expression remained tense. "I'll be fine. I've just been dealing with a lot lately. This didn't help." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she blinked rapidly to keep tears at bay. Chief Bryant tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her jaw clenching. "I'm sorry this happened. It shouldn't have." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "And it won't go unanswered." Maya glanced at her, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering distrust. "I've heard that before," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But things don't change, people like that." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind." The chief didn't press her, but her silence carried a weight of understanding. She parked in front of the clinic and quickly got out, moving to Maya's side to help her out of the car. Maya accepted the assistance reluctantly, her steps cautious but steady. "I'll wait here for you," Bryant said firmly. "Take as much time as you need. I'll make sure you're not left stranded again." Maya paused at the clinic door, turning to face the chief. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Most people in your position wouldn't care." Bryant met her gaze, her expression resolute. "Because it's my job to care. And because this isn't the first time I've had to clean up someone else's mess. Hopefully, it'll be the last." Maya studied her for a moment, then nodded and disappeared inside. As Bryant returned to the car, her phone buzzed with a call from the station. It was her deputy, Officer Reed. "Chief, we've got a situation," he said, his voice tense. "People are already talking about what happened with Daniels. The footage is all over social media." Bryant exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "Of course it is. What are they saying?" Reed hesitated. "It's bad. The community's furious and the mayor's office called. They want answers." Bryant leaned back in the driver's seat, her mind racing. She knew this was more than just an internal issue now. The public wanted action, and Daniel's behavior was only the tip of the iceberg. "Call a meeting with the department," she said firmly. "I want everyone there by the time I get back. This ends today." As she hung up, Bryant's gaze lingered on the clinic doors. She thought about Maya, the pain in her voice, and the exhaustion in her eyes. This wasn't just about Daniels. This was about the entire system, one that had failed too many people for too long. She sighed deeply, knowing that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. The tension in the precinct conference room was palpable when Chief Bryant walked in. Every officer had been called in, and the room buzzed with murmurs of curiosity and unease. Daniel sat stiffly at the far end of the table, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. As the chief entered, the room fell silent, her presence demanding attention without a single word. Bryant placed a folder on the table, her expression stern. "I'm not here to sugarcoat anything," she began, her voice cutting through the silence. "What happened today with Maya Johnson wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of respect, and frankly, a failure of this department." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Bryant's sharp gaze swept across the room, making it clear that her words were meant for everyone, not just him. "I've seen the footage," she continued, her tone firm, "and so has the public. Right now, we're not just dealing with one bad call. We're dealing with the trust this department has broken, again and again. Daniel's actions today could have escalated into a tragedy, and I won't stand by and let that slide." The murmurs started again, low and uncertain. Bryant held up a hand, silencing them. "This isn't the first complaint we've had about officers making biased assumptions, and it won't be the last unless we change. I've already spoken with the mayor's office, and we're implementing mandatory bias training effective immediately." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Some officers exchanged glances, while others stared at the table. Daniels finally spoke, his voice defensive. "Chief, I was following procedure. She broke the law. I was just doing my job." Bryant's eyes locked onto his, and her expression hardened. "Your job is to enforce the law fairly, Daniels, not to humiliate or endanger the people you're supposed to protect. A pregnant woman, in visible distress, should never have been treated the way you treated her today. That wasn't policing, it was abuse of power." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Bryant didn't give him the chance. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Your actions will be reviewed, and I'll decide if you have any place in this department going forward." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words sinking in. Bryant took a deep breath, her voice softening slightly as she addressed the group. "I know most of you come to work every day trying to do the right thing, but we have a problem here, and ignoring it won't make it go away. We need to be better, for ourselves, for this community, and for the people who trust us to protect them." Her gaze lingered on each officer, daring them to challenge her. "The badge isn't a shield to hide behind. It's a symbol of responsibility. If you can't carry that weight, you're in the wrong place." As Bryant closed the meeting, she felt the eyes of her officers on her. some filled with respect, others with resentment. She knew the changes she was proposing wouldn't be easy. But as she walked back to her office, her phone buzzed again. It was a notification, another video of the incident with Maya, this one already gaining thousands of views. Bryant sighed. The storm was far from over, but she wasn't about to back down. Not this time. Chief Bryant sat at her desk, the soft glow of her computer screen casting long shadows in the dim office. She scrolled through the video of the incident again, her jaw tightening with each replay. The public reaction was loud and clear. Anger, frustration, and calls for accountability flooded the comments. Local news stations had picked up the story, and the footage was being analyzed from every angle. It wasn't just about Daniels. It had become a symbol of deeper issues within the department. Her office door creaked open, and Deputy Officer Reed stepped in, his face etched with concern. "Chief, we've got reporters camped outside. They're not leaving without a statement." Bryant leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Of course they are," she muttered. "What's the mayor saying?" "He's worried, wants to make sure this doesn't turn into a citywide protest," Reed replied. "He's expecting you to take the heat." Bryant's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew how this worked. The department would face the brunt of the backlash, and she would be the one holding the microphone. "I'll deal with it," she said, standing up. "But this can't just be about optics. If we don't show real change, this department is done." Reed nodded, hesitating before speaking again. "There's something else. Daniels called his union rep. He's claiming the arrest was justified and accusing you of overstepping." Bryant's jaw clenched. "He can claim whatever he wants. I've got the video, and the video doesn't lie." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "The union's going to fight this, Chief. They're saying the bias training is just a PR move, and that Daniels was within his rights to detain Maya." Bryant exhaled slowly, her frustration mounting. "Let them fight it. This isn't about Daniels anymore. It's about every officer who thinks what he did was acceptable." Before Reed could respond, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but she answered it anyway. "Chief Bryant." The voice on the other end was soft but resolute. "Chief, this is Maya Johnson. I wanted to thank you for helping me today." Bryant's posture softened slightly, but she could hear the hesitation in Maya's voice. "Maya, you don't need to thank me. What happened to you was unacceptable. I'm sorry it happened at all." There was a pause before Maya spoke again. "I appreciate that, but this isn't just about me. What happened today? It's been happening in this community for years. People like Officer Daniels don't see us. They just see threats." Bryant closed her eyes, her hand tightening around the phone. "You're right," she said quietly. "And that's exactly what I'm trying to change." Maya's voice grew firmer. "Then don't let this die down. Don't let this be another story people forget about after the news cycle moves on. If you really want to change things, start with your department. Start with people like Daniels." Bryant felt a surge of respect for Maya's courage. "I won't let this go," she promised. "Not this time." After the call ended, Bryant sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She glanced at the folder on her desk containing Daniel's record. A thought struck her, and she opened it, flipping through the pages. Several minor complaints had been filed against him during his short tenure. Nothing major, but enough to paint a troubling picture. Her intercom buzzed, breaking her train of thought. "Chief, the reporters are asking for you," the receptionist said. Bryant stood, adjusting her uniform. "Let's give them what they're waiting for," she said, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about answering questions. It was about taking the first step towards something bigger. The press conference was set up in front of the precinct, the step serving as a stage for Chief Bryant. Reporters crowded together, microphones extended toward the podium. A group of community members gathered on the sidewalk, their expressions ranging from skepticism to anger. Bryant could feel the weight of every eye on her as she stepped up to the microphone. The flashes of cameras began almost immediately. She scanned the crowd, her gaze steady, before she leaned into the mic. "Good evening," she began, her voice firm but measured. "I'm Chief Angela Bryant, and I'm here to address what happened earlier today." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Bryant continued, her tone unwavering. "This afternoon, Officer Daniels detained a woman during a routine traffic stop. That woman, Maya Johnson, is pregnant and was on her way to a medical appointment. What should have been a simple warning turned into an unnecessary escalation." She paused, letting her words settle before pressing on. "Let me be clear. This incident does not reflect the standards or values this department should uphold. The actions taken were unacceptable, and Officer Daniels has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." A hand shot up from the press. "Chief Bryant, do you believe this was racially motivated?" Bryant hesitated for only a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I believe that Officer Daniels' actions were rooted in bias, conscious or not. This is why we are implementing immediate reforms, starting with mandatory bias training for every officer in this department. This is not about protecting one officer's reputation. This is about rebuilding trust." The crowd murmured louder, some nodding in agreement while others remained skeptical. Another reporter spoke up, her tone pointed. "Chief, critics are saying these measures are just a way to pacify the public. How do you respond to that?" Bryant straightened her shoulders, her gaze firm. "Words without action mean nothing. I won't stand here and promise perfection overnight. Change takes time, but it starts with accountability. That's why, in addition to bias training, we will create a civilian oversight board to review cases of misconduct. This department will no longer investigate itself unchecked." The murmurs turned into scattered applause from the community members. The reporters continued their questions, but Bryant held up a hand. "I'll take one more question." A young journalist stepped forward, her voice clear and direct. "Chief, what message do you want to send to Maya Johnson and others in this community who have experienced similar incidents?" Bryant took a deep breath, her voice softening just enough to carry the weight of sincerity. "To Maya and everyone else who's felt unseen, unheard, or unprotected by those sworn to serve them, I say this: I hear you, I see you, and I promise to do everything in my power to make this right, not just for today, but for every day moving forward." As she stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted into a mix of applause and lingering murmurs of doubt. Bryant felt the tension in her chest loosen slightly, but she knew this was only the beginning. Behind her, in the precinct, she could already see Daniels glaring out a window, his resentment clear. She ignored it. There was too much at stake to worry about bruised egos. Walking back inside, she found Maya waiting in the lobby, her expression cautious but curious. "You didn't hold back out there," Maya said quietly. Bryant smiled faintly. "I couldn't afford to. Not this time." Maya nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Let's hope it's more than just words." "It will be," Bryant said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Chief Bryant returned to her office, exhaustion tugging at her, but she didn't have time to rest. The day's events had already spiraled into something far larger than a single incident. Calls from city officials, emails from community leaders, and endless social media notifications swirled together into a storm that needed immediate attention. As she sat down, her phone buzzed with a call from the mayor. Bryant braced herself, picking up. "Mayor Grant." "Angela," the mayor's voice was clipped, frustration clear. "I've been fielding calls all evening. This situation with Daniels is a PR nightmare. People are angry, and the media isn't letting up." Bryant straightened in her chair. "With respect, Mayor, this isn't just about PR. This is about trust, and we've lost it. The public has every right to be angry." "Be that as it may," Grant replied, his tone softening slightly. "You've put us in a tight spot with these reforms you announced. A civilian oversight board, bias training. That's going to ruffle feathers with the union." "Let them ruffle," Bryant said sharply. "We've let this go unchecked for too long. If we don't make changes now, the city's going to pay for it later, with protests, lawsuits, or worse." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Finally, the mayor sighed. You're not wrong, but you've made this personal. The union's already talking about Daniels filing a grievance against you. Bryant clenched her jaw. Let him. This isn't about me, Mayor. It's about holding this department accountable. If Daniels wants to fight it, he'll have to explain his actions to the oversight board. The mayor sighed again, longer this time. All right, Angela. I'll back you on this, for now. But be ready for pushback. Bryant hung up, leaning back in her chair as the weight of the situation settled deeper on her shoulders. She knew she had stepped onto a precarious path, but there was no turning back now. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. It was Reed. "Chief," he said, stepping inside. "Daniels is in the briefing room. He's demanding to speak with you." Bryant's eyes narrowed. "Demanding?" Reed nodded grimly. "He's saying this whole thing is unfair. He wants his side of the story to be heard." Bryant stood, her shoulders squared. "Then let's hear it." In the briefing room, Daniels sat at the far end of the table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw was set, and his eyes burned with defiance. Bryant entered, closing the door behind her, and sat down across from him. For a moment the room was silent, the tension thick between them. "All right, Daniels," Bryant said evenly. "You wanted to speak. I'm listening." Daniels leaned forward, his voice tight with frustration. "What happened out there wasn't what you're making it out to be. I followed protocol. She didn't stop at the sign. She was argumentative. I acted according to training." Bryant's gaze didn't waver. "Your training tells you to handcuff a visibly pregnant woman who's calmly trying to explain herself. She was reaching into her car." Daniels shot back. "How was I supposed to know what she was grabbing?" "Did you ask her?" Bryant countered, her tone sharp. "Did you pause to consider the situation before escalating it?" Daniels faltered for a moment but recovered quickly. "I was doing my job." "No, Daniels," Bryant said, her voice colder now. "You were abusing your authority. You weren't thinking about her safety, her condition, or the community you're supposed to serve. You saw a black woman and made assumptions." Daniels's face flushed red. "That's not fair." Bryant leaned forward, her voice lowering but losing none of its edge. "What's not fair, Daniels, is how often people like Maya are treated as threats before they're even given a chance to speak. What's not fair is the fear people feel when they see someone like you pulling them over. You may not see it, but your actions today were part of a bigger problem." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Bryant raised a hand to stop him. "This isn't just about you. This is about what you represent when you wear that badge. If you can't understand that, you don't belong in this uniform." Daniels sat back, his defiance wavering. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a scowl. "I'll take this to the union," he muttered. Bryant stood, her tone final. "Do what you need to do. But this department will change, with or without you." She turned and walked out, leaving Daniels alone with his thoughts. Chief Bryant closed the door behind her and paused in the hallway, the tension of the confrontation still hanging in the air. Her conversation with Daniels had been draining, but it reaffirmed her conviction. Change wouldn't come easily, especially with officers like him entrenched in old habits and defensiveness. As she walked toward her office, Reed caught up to her. "You all right, Chief?" he asked, his voice low. Bryant nodded, though her expression was tense. "Daniels doesn't get it, and honestly, I don't know if he ever will." Reed hesitated. "There's something else you should know. The union rep just called. Daniels filed his grievance, and they're pushing back hard on the bias training. They're framing it as punitive instead of educational." Bryant stopped, her jaw tightening. "They're doubling down?" Reed gave her a grim nod. "It's turning into a bigger battle than just Daniels. The union's saying your reforms are unnecessary and undermining morale." Bryant let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "Let them talk. If they want to fight this publicly, I'll meet them head on. The community deserves better, and I'm not backing down." Reed's expression softened slightly. "You've got a lot of support out there, Chief, not just from the community. Plenty of officers want these changes too. They're just afraid to speak up. Bryant glanced at him, surprised by the admission. Is that so? Reed nodded. You're not alone in this, even if it feels like it. You've got people behind you. The faintest hint of a smile touched Bryant's lips, though her eyes remained determined. Good, because this isn't a fight I can win on my own. Back in her office, Bryant sat down and opened her laptop, drafting a memo to the entire department. She knew the union's resistance would only intensify, but she also knew she couldn't waver now. As she typed, her words were deliberate, clear, and uncompromising. This department is at a crossroads. We can either continue as we've always done, letting bias and fear dictate our actions, or we can rise to the challenge and rebuild the trust we've lost. Change is never easy, but it's necessary, and it starts with us. She attached the finalized bias training schedule and sent the memo to every officer. Then she leaned back, her mind racing with the steps still ahead. The Civilian Oversight Board, public outreach, and internal evaluations, all critical pieces of a much larger puzzle. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another call from Maya Johnson. Ms. Johnson, Bryant said, answering quickly. Is everything all right? Maya's voice was calm, but carried a quiet urgency. I wanted to thank you for speaking up today. But I also wanted to warn you, people in the community are watching closely. They've seen promises like this before, and they don't believe change is real until it lasts. Bryant nodded, even though Maya couldn't see her. I understand, and you're right to feel that way. This department has failed before, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we don't fail again. There was a pause on the line before Maya replied. Then keep your word, Chief, because if you don't, it's not just the department you'll lose. It's this entire community. The line went dead, leaving Bryant staring at her phone, the weight of Maya's words pressing down on her. She set the phone aside and stared out her office window. The city lights glimmered in the distance, and the muffled hum of activity filtered through the precinct walls. Change was coming, but the battle was far from over, and Bryant knew the hardest fights were yet to come. The precinct buzzed with tension the next morning as officers filed into the briefing room for the first scheduled bias training session. Some entered with quiet determination, ready to listen and learn. Others walked in with visible reluctance, muttering under their breath about politics and overreach. Chief Bryant stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, observing the mix of expressions. Officer Daniels sat near the corner, his jaw tight and his eyes focused straight ahead. His presence felt like a storm cloud hovering over the room, a visible reminder of the incident that had ignited this change. Bryant's gaze lingered on him for a moment before shifting to the front, as the trainer, a woman in her late 40s with a calm but authoritative demeanor, began the session. Good morning, the trainer began, her voice even. My name is Dr. Monica Reed, and I'm here to talk about something that often goes unspoken but is always present. Bias. The room stirred, a few officers exchanging wary glances. Reed continued without hesitation. Bias isn't about being a bad person. It's about the assumptions we all carry, often without realizing it. But when those assumptions dictate our actions, especially as officers of the law, they can have dangerous, even deadly consequences. Bryant watched as the officers shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, listening intently. Others sat back, arms crossed, their skepticism apparent. Reed walked to the whiteboard, writing 2 words in large, bold letters. Assumption and impact. Let's start with a simple exercise, she said, turning back to the group. Raise your hand if you've ever made an assumption about someone based on their appearance. The room went silent. A few hands went up hesitantly, while others stayed firmly at their sides. Daniels didn't move, his expression unreadable. Now, keep your hand up if you've ever realized later that assumption was wrong. More hands rose, though some officers looked visibly uncomfortable. Reed smiled slightly, her tone softening. That discomfort you feel right now, that's the point. Growth begins where comfort ends. As the session continued, Reed shared real-life examples of biased policing and the ripple effects it had on communities. She spoke of trust eroded, lives shattered, and opportunities for change missed. The room grew quieter, the resistance waning as her words sank in. During a break, Bryant stepped outside, her thoughts racing. She had hoped the training would be impactful, but she knew it was only the first step. Her phone buzzed with a text from Reed. Media requests piling up. They're asking for follow-ups on the reforms. Bryant sighed, pocketing her phone. The weight of public scrutiny never seemed to lift. She turned back toward the room, catching sight of Daniels standing near the coffee machine. He was alone, his usual defiance replaced by something more subdued. "You doing all right, Daniels?" she asked, her tone careful. He glanced at her, his jaw working as if he was deciding what to say. "It's a lot to take in," he admitted finally, his voice low. "Makes you think about things differently." Bryant studied him for a moment, surprised by his honesty. "That's the point, Daniels. None of us are perfect. But the question is, what do we do once we see where we've fallen short?" Daniels didn't respond, but the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes gave Bryant a small glimmer of hope. She left him to his thoughts and returned to the session, where Dr. Reed was wrapping up a powerful segment about community relationships. As the training ended and officers filed out, Bryant stood by the door, watching each of them closely. Some nodded respectfully as they passed. Others avoided her gaze. But Daniels paused, his expression conflicted. "Chief," he said, his voice hesitant, "do you really think this is going to change anything?" Bryant met his gaze, her tone steady. "It depends on you, Daniels. It depends on all of us." For a moment he said nothing, then gave a curt nod and walked away. Bryant watched him go, her determination hardening. The road ahead was long, but today had been a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed. The following days at the precinct felt like a slow grind. The bias training sessions continued, and while some officers began engaging with the material, others remained outwardly resistant. Chief Bryant made it a point to attend every session, standing in the back of the room, ensuring her presence was both a reminder and a statement of her commitment. Meanwhile, the community's response to the reforms was mixed. Some saw the efforts as genuine and overdue, while others dismissed them as performative. Maya Johnson's name had become a rallying cry for accountability in the city. Social media posts carried hashtags demanding justice, and community leaders began organizing forums to address broader issues with law enforcement. Bryant knew the department was under a microscope, and every move they made, or failed to make, would be scrutinized. One afternoon, as Bryant worked through a pile of reports in her office, Reed knocked on the door and stepped in, holding a folder. "You need to see this," he said, placing it on her desk. Bryant opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. It contained the results of an internal review she had ordered after Maya's arrest. What she saw made her stomach tighten. Daniels wasn't the only officer with a troubling record. Several others had logged repeated complaints of excessive force, bias, and misconduct, many of which had been quietly dismissed or ignored. "This is worse than I thought," Bryant muttered, flipping through the pages. Reed nodded grimly. "It's not just a few bad apples. There's a pattern here, and it's been going on for years." Bryant closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "If this comes out, and it will, it's going to blow up. The community already has their doubts about us. This will confirm everything they believe." Reed hesitated before speaking. "What are you going to do?" Bryant's eyes hardened. "We can't bury this, Reed. If we want real change, we have to start by admitting where we've gone wrong. Transparency is the only way forward." Reed looked uncertain. "The union's not going to like that." Bryant let out a humorless laugh. "The union doesn't like anything I've done since I walked through these doors. That's not going to stop me." She stood, pacing the room. "We're going to audit every complaint, reopen cases that were dismissed without proper investigation, and create a public-facing database for misconduct reports. If this department has skeletons, we're dragging them out of the closet." Reed gave her a long look. You realize this could blow back on you. If the public loses all trust, you might not just lose the department. You could lose your job. Bryant stopped pacing and turned to him, her expression resolute. If I lose my job because I did the right thing, so be it. I didn't sign up for this to protect my reputation. I signed up to protect this community. Reed nodded slowly, his respect for her clear. All right, Chief, I'll start pulling the files. As Reed left the office, Bryant sat back down, staring at the folder on her desk. The weight of her decisions pressed heavily on her, but she knew there was no alternative. She opened her laptop and began drafting a statement for the public. If the department was going to come clean, it had to come from her. The statement didn't mince words. It acknowledged the department's failings, apologized to the community, and outlined the steps they were taking to rebuild trust. As she typed, Bryant felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The fallout would be brutal, but she reminded herself of Maya's words. If you don't follow through, you'll lose more than the department. You'll lose this community. When she finished, she sent the draft to Reed for review, then leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. The battle was far from over, but Bryant had already made her choice. There was no turning back now. The press conference announcing the internal audit was scheduled for the following afternoon. The precinct buzzed with activity as staff prepared statements, adjusted protocols, and braced for the fallout. Word had already leaked that Chief Bryant planned to address long-ignored complaints, and the media gathered outside, their cameras ready. Inside her office, Bryant reviewed her speech one last time. Reed entered with a stack of files, placing them on her desk. These are the first batch of reopened cases, he said. Some of them are messy, Chief. A few of these officers are still on active duty. Bryant glanced at the files, her resolve hardening. We'll deal with it. One case at a time if we have to. Reed hesitated, then added, Daniels is stirring things up. He's been talking to other officers, saying this audit is a witch hunt. Some are starting to side with him. Bryant leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. Let them. The ones who fight transparency are the ones we need to watch closest. Reed nodded but looked uneasy. Just be careful, Chief. If Daniels is rallying support, this could turn ugly. Bryant's jaw tightened. Ugly or not, we're moving forward. If people like Daniels want to fight, they'll expose themselves for who they are. As Reed left, Bryant took a deep breath, steeling herself for the press conference. She knew that every word she said would be picked apart, every promise she made scrutinized. But this was her moment to set the tone for what came next. At exactly 3 p.m., Bryant stepped onto the podium outside the precinct. The crowd of reporters and community members had grown, their anticipation palpable. The cameras flashed as she adjusted the microphone, scanning the faces before her. I stand before you today, she began, her voice firm, to address a legacy of mistakes that this department has made. For too long, complaints of bias, misconduct, and abuse of power have been dismissed or ignored. That ends now. The crowd murmured, their reactions mixed. Bryant continued, her tone resolute. We are launching a full audit of all past complaints, and every case will be reopened and reviewed. This will not be easy. It will not be quick. But it is necessary. The trust of this community depends on it. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This department exists to serve and protect everyone, not just some. To the community I say this. We hear you. We see you. And we are committed to earning back your trust no matter how long it takes. A reporter raised her hand. Chief, do you believe this will fix the deep-seated issues in law enforcement? Bryant didn't hesitate. This is a start. Real change takes time and sustained effort. But without transparency, there can be no accountability. And without accountability, there can be no trust. The crowd broke into applause, though it was scattered and cautious. Bryant stepped back from the podium, her expression composed, but the tension in her chest lingered. The real work was just beginning. As the crowd dispersed, Bryant returned to her office to find Maya Johnson waiting for her in the lobby. Maya's expression was calm but guarded, her arms crossed as she leaned against the wall. Bryant motioned for her to follow, and they entered the privacy of her office. Maya sat across from Bryant, her gaze unwavering. "I heard the speech," she said, her voice neutral. "It sounded good, but speeches don't change things." Bryant nodded, understanding the skepticism. "You're right. They don't. But the audit isn't just talk. We've already reopened cases, and I'll personally oversee every decision that comes out of it." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying Bryant. "And what about officers like Daniels? What happens to them?" Bryant's expression tightened. "If the audit reveals patterns of misconduct, those officers will face the consequences: termination, retraining, or criminal charges if necessary. I'm not here to protect bad cops." Maya leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "And what about the culture? It's not just a few bad apples, it's the whole system. You can fire Daniels, but what stops the next officer from doing the same thing?" Bryant let out a slow breath. "Changing a culture takes time, but it starts with accountability. Officers need to know that their actions have consequences. That's why we're bringing in the oversight board, why we're implementing community liaisons, and why this audit is only the beginning." Maya leaned back, her skepticism softening slightly. "You've got a long road ahead, Chief. People will fight you on this, inside and outside the department." Bryant gave a faint smile. "I know, but I'm not afraid of a fight." Maya studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Chief. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, for now, but I'll be watching." As Maya stood to leave, Bryant rose as well, extending her hand. Maya hesitated, then shook it. The gesture felt small but significant, a tentative bridge between two people who both wanted the same thing, even if they came from different perspectives. When Maya left, Bryant sat back down, the weight of her responsibilities pressing on her. She glanced at the stack of reopened cases on her desk, each one a reminder of how far they still had to go. But as she began sorting through them, she felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it had to start somewhere, and she was determined to see it through. As the audit progressed, tensions within the precinct reached a boiling point. Officers who had prided themselves on years of unchallenged authority now found themselves under scrutiny. The reopened cases revealed troubling patterns. Incidents brushed under the rug, complaints dismissed without investigation, and evidence that officers like Daniels had been protected by an unspoken code of silence. One afternoon, Bryant called a department-wide meeting. The precinct's common room was filled with officers, some clearly anxious, others visibly angry. Daniels sat near the back, his arms crossed, his defiance on full display. Bryant stood at the front, her expression steeled. "This audit isn't about punishing people for past mistakes," she began, her voice even. "It's about understanding where we went wrong and making sure it doesn't happen again." Daniels scoffed audibly, and several heads turned in his direction. Bryant ignored him and continued. "We've uncovered several cases that should have been properly investigated but weren't. That failure falls on this department, and it's a failure I take responsibility for as your chief." Her admission sent a ripple through the room. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, caught off guard by her willingness to shoulder the blame. "But responsibility doesn't end with me," Bryant added. "Every officer in this room is part of this department's legacy, good and bad. If we want to move forward, we need to acknowledge our mistakes and commit to doing better." Daniel stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence. "With all due respect, Chief, this feels like a witch hunt. You're dragging good officers through the mud for doing their jobs. It's easy to criticize from behind a desk." Bryant locked eyes with him, her voice calm but sharp. "This isn't about criticizing, it's about accountability. And if you think being held to a higher standard is unfair, maybe you're in the wrong profession." The room went silent, the weight of her words settling heavily. Daniels glared at her for a moment before sitting back down, muttering under his breath. Bryant scanned the room, her gaze steady. "If anyone here feels they can't meet these standards, now is the time to speak up, because this department is changing, with or without you." No one else spoke. The silence wasn't necessarily agreement, but it was a sign that the message had landed. As the meeting ended and officers began filing out, Bryant watched them closely, wondering who would rise to the challenge and who might choose to walk away. The pressure outside the department continued to build. Community forums organized by local leaders became standing room-only events, with residents sharing their stories of mistrust and fear. At one such meeting, Bryant decided to attend in person, sitting quietly in the back as speaker after speaker recounted their experiences. An elderly man stood, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years, he said, "and in all that time, I've never felt like the police were here for us. They see us as threats, not neighbors." A young woman followed, holding back tears as she described being stopped multiple times on her way to work. "I've never done anything wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "But every time I see those lights behind me, I wonder if today's the day it goes too far." Bryant listened intently, her stomach tightening with each story. She knew these weren't isolated incidents. They were a reflection of a system that had long prioritized authority over understanding. When the moderator opened the floor to questions, a man in the crowd turned to Bryant, his tone sharp. "What are you going to do about it, Chief? We've heard promises before. What makes you any different?" Bryant stood, the room falling silent as she walked to the front. She faced the crowd, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. "I can't change the past," she began, "but I can change what happens next. The audit we're conducting is just the beginning. We're implementing new protocols, creating a civilian oversight board, and ensuring officers who violate their oath face consequences. But I know that words mean nothing without action." She scanned the faces in the crowd, her expression firm. "I'm here tonight because I want to hear from you. Not just about what's gone wrong, but about what you need from us moving forward. I'm not here to defend the mistakes of this department. I'm here to fix them." The room was quiet for a moment before someone in the back clapped. The applause spread slowly, hesitantly, but it grew louder, filling the room. Bryant felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was a start, and for now that was enough. The applause from the community forum had barely faded when Chief Bryant returned to the precinct that night. The quiet hum of the station's fluorescent lights seemed almost ominous. As she entered her office, she found a sealed envelope on her desk, with her name written in bold black letters. She opened it cautiously, her eyes scanning the typed note inside. "Stop digging where you don't belong. You're stirring a pot that's better left untouched. For your own good, leave it alone." Bryant's jaw tightened, her heartbeat quickening. The letter was unsigned, but its meaning was clear. Someone, likely within the department, wanted to intimidate her into backing down. She stared at the paper for a long moment before placing it carefully in her desk drawer. She didn't have time to process the threat when Reed knocked on her door and stepped in, holding another folder. "Chief, you're going to want to see this," he said, his tone serious. Bryant gestured for him to sit and he handed her the file. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open. "It's Daniel's," Reed said. "We've found more in his record, incidents that were never formally documented but were flagged by other officers." Bryant's eyes scanned the pages. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal harassment jumped out at her. Most of them were accompanied by notes from superior officers dismissing the complaints as unsubstantiated or handled internally. "This is worse than I thought," Bryant muttered, shaking her head. "How has this been buried for so long?" Reed hesitated. "You know how it works, Chief. People cover for each other. Cases disappear. It's not just Daniels, it's a system that's protected him." Bryant closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "If this gets out, and it will, it's going to blow up in our faces. The community already doesn't trust us, and this will only confirm their worst fears." "So what's the plan?" Reed asked. Bryant sat forward, her expression resolute. "We bring it to the oversight board, every single case. If Daniels is as guilty as this suggests, we take action. No excuses, no delays. Reed nodded, but his face remained tense. The union's going to come down hard on this, Chief. They'll accuse you of throwing him under the bus to save face. Bryant's voice was firm. This isn't about saving face, it's about doing what's right. If Daniels has been abusing his authority, he has no place in this department, and anyone who covered for him is going to answer for it. Reed stood, a flicker of respect in his eyes. All right, I'll start preparing the cases for review. As he left, Bryant sat alone in her office, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She opened the drawer and pulled out the threatening note again, reading it over carefully. Whoever had sent it was afraid of what she might uncover, and that only fueled her determination to see it through. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. When the voice on the other end answered, she spoke firmly. "This is Chief Angela Bryant. I need to report a threat, and I want an external investigator assigned immediately." The voice on the other end paused, then replied, "We'll take it from here, Chief." Bryant hung up and leaned back in her chair. The storm was brewing, but she wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. The precinct was unusually quiet the next morning, the kind of silence that felt heavy with unspoken tension. Chief Bryant walked through the halls, her expression unreadable but her mind racing. The threat she'd received and the damning information in Daniels's file had made one thing clear. This wasn't just about reforming policies. This was about rooting out a culture of complacency and cover-ups that had been festering for years. She entered the briefing room, where Reed and a small group of trusted officers waited. A whiteboard at the front listed the reopened cases tied to Daniels and several other officers. Bryant stepped forward, her tone brisk and focused. "We're moving forward with the Oversight Board's first review," she said, gesturing to the cases. "These complaints are no longer just allegations. They're evidence of systemic failures that we allowed to happen." Reed spoke up, his voice steady but cautious. "Chief, the union is already pushing back. They're calling this a witch hunt and threatening legal action. They've also filed an injunction to stop the Oversight Board from accessing personnel records." Bryant's eyes narrowed. "Let them try. We're not hiding behind closed doors anymore. If they want to fight transparency, they'll have to explain to the public why they're afraid of accountability." One of the younger officers raised a hand hesitantly. "Chief, what if Daniels, or anyone else involved, tries to retaliate? There's a lot of tension in the department right now. Some people feel like they're being targeted." Bryant's gaze softened slightly. "We're not targeting anyone. We're holding people accountable. If anyone feels threatened by that, they need to take a hard look at their actions and ask themselves why." The officer nodded, but the room remained tense. Bryant continued, her voice firmer now. "This isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to make us popular, but we have a choice. Either we lead the change, or we let this department sink under the weight of its own failures. I need all of you to be ready for what's coming." As the meeting ended, Bryant lingered at the whiteboard, her eyes scanning the list of names and cases. The sheer volume of misconduct documented in the files was staggering, but it only strengthened her resolve. She couldn't change the past, but she could make sure it didn't define their future. Later that afternoon, Bryant sat in her office with Maya Johnson, who had requested another meeting. Maya had brought a notebook filled with stories and complaints from other community members who had reached out to her since the incident with Daniels. "They want their voices heard," Maya said, placing the notebook on Bryant's desk. "These are people who've been stopped, harassed, or ignored by officers who never faced consequences. They don't trust the system, Chief. And honestly, I don't blame them." Bryant opened the notebook, her heart sinking as she skimmed the pages. Each entry was a story of pain, fear, and distrust, a grim reminder of how much work lay ahead. "I know trust has to be earned," Bryant said, meeting Maya's gaze. "That's why we're doing the audit, the Oversight Board, all of it. But I also know words aren't enough." Maya leaned forward, her voice firm. "Then prove it. Let the community be part of the process. Don't just give us updates. Invite us in. Let us see the changes as they happen." Bryant considered this, nodding slowly. "You're right. We need more transparency, not just internally, but with the people we serve. I'll work on setting up regular community meetings, forums where people can see the progress we're making and hold us accountable. Maya's expression softened slightly. That's a start, but people will be watching closely. They're tired of empty promises. So am I, Bryant replied, her voice steady. This isn't about promises anymore. It's about results. Maya stood, extending her hand. Then we'll see what you do, Chief. Bryant shook her hand firmly. You will. After Maya left, Bryant sat alone in her office, staring at the notebook. It was more than a collection of stories. It was a roadmap of where the department had failed. She picked up her pen and began jotting down notes, outlining the next steps to address each issue. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that real change was possible. The final review of Daniel's case and the other reopened files was set for a Friday morning, marking the culmination of weeks of tension, reform, and public scrutiny. The Civilian Oversight Board, comprised of respected community leaders, legal experts, and retired law enforcement, convened in a large conference room at City Hall. The media had been barred from the proceedings, but the anticipation outside was palpable. Protesters lined the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for Maya," and "No more silence." Chief Bryant arrived early, a thick stack of documents in hand. She had spent the night preparing her presentation, determined to leave no room for doubt. As she stepped into the room, she was met with the stern but hopeful gazes of the board members. At the center of the long table sat the chair of the board, an elder stateswoman named Evelyn Carter, who had spent decades advocating for civil rights. "Chief Bryant," Evelyn said, motioning for her to sit. "Thank you for joining us." Bryant nodded, placing the documents on the table. "Thank you for taking this on. I know it hasn't been easy." Evelyn's gaze was steady. Reckoning with the truth never is, but it's necessary. The proceedings began with a detailed review of Daniels' record. Complaint after complaint was read aloud, each one painting a damning picture of a pattern of misconduct. The board members asked pointed questions, and Bryant answered them with unflinching honesty. "Why wasn't this addressed sooner?" one board member asked, his tone sharp. Bryant didn't flinch. "The systems in place allowed these complaints to be dismissed or buried. That's why we're overhauling those systems now. We're creating safeguards to ensure this can't happen again." The board continued their questioning, turning their attention to other officers implicated in the audit. Bryant presented evidence, outlined new protocols, and explained how the department planned to rebuild trust. Each word she spoke felt like a step forward, but the weight of what had been uncovered lingered heavily in the room. Finally, it was Daniel's turn to speak. He sat at the far end of the table, flanked by his union representative. His tone was defensive, his words rehearsed. "I followed procedure," Daniels insisted. "I did what I was trained to do. If there was a misunderstanding, that's unfortunate, but I never acted out of bias." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Daniels, how do you explain the consistent pattern of complaints against you? Multiple people from different incidents have described similar behavior." Daniels shifted in his seat. "People can say whatever they want. It doesn't mean it's true." Bryant interjected, her voice steady but cutting. "The evidence says otherwise, Daniels. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a larger problem, one that this department failed to address, until now." Daniels's face reddened, but he didn't respond. The silence in the room was heavy as Evelyn turned back to Bryant. "Chief, based on this audit and the evidence presented, what do you recommend for Officer Daniels?" Bryant took a deep breath, her voice clear and unwavering. "Termination, and if further investigation supports it, criminal charges." A murmur spread through the room, and Daniels' union representative stood, protesting loudly. "This is a vendetta. You're scapegoating him to save face." Evelyn raised a hand, silencing the outburst. "We've heard enough. The board will deliberate and issue our recommendations by the end of the day." The session adjourned, and Bryant stepped outside into the glaring sunlight. The crowd of protesters erupted into cheers and chants as she emerged, though some voices called out for more drastic action. She raised a hand, acknowledging them, but didn't stop to speak. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. Back at the precinct, she found Reed waiting in her office. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. "How'd it go?" he asked. Bryant sat down, exhaling deeply. "The board has all the evidence they need. If they don't recommend his termination, I'll push for it myself." Reed nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "You've done more in these past few weeks than this department has in years. People are starting to notice." Bryant gave a faint smile. "Noticed or not, the work isn't done. This was just the first battle." As evening fell, Bryant received a call from Evelyn Carter. The board had unanimously recommended Daniels' termination and the referral of his case to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. Bryant thanked her and hung up, staring out her office window as the city lights flickered in the distance. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. The department still needed to rebuild trust, implement the reforms, and address the culture that had allowed officers like Daniels to thrive. But for the first time, there was real momentum, a sense that change wasn't just possible, it was happening. As she gathered her things to leave for the night, Bryant paused, glancing at the notebook Maya had left on her desk. It reminded her of the voices that had fueled this fight, voices that demanded justice, accountability, and respect. She picked it up and placed it in her bag, a symbol of the work still left to do. Walking out of the precinct, she felt the eyes of her officers on her. Some looked uncertain, others resentful, but a few, just a few, seemed hopeful. And for Bryant, that hope was enough to keep going. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.